Hello, everybody. Today, I am so thrilled to get to introduce you to somebody who I have been following online for a little bit and have been super impressed by. You might know him as Pastor Knothead on TikTok. He has over 330,000 some followers there. I have met him and know him as Pastor Bob, but I am excited to get to introduce him to you all today. He put some beautiful thoughts and messages out there in the world around inclusivity and seeing the beauty in God and everybody, that everybody has worth. And so I am so thrilled to get to have this conversation with him today. So welcome. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Pastor Bob, do you want to just start off by introducing yourself a little bit about kind of your journey, where you've been, where you are now, how you've kind of come to this place of advocacy and inclusion?
Sure. So my name is Bob Irian. I am a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, and I always say we're not that kind of evangelical. We use that word, we use it in the classical sense of rooted in the gospel, not in the modern American right-wing conservative meaning of that word.
Good distinction.
I started seminary in 2000. I grew up in South Texas in a very small town in the 80s and 90s with all of the mindsets and attitudes and prejudices that went with that kind of environment in the 80s and 90s. And I just came to understand in college and then during my time in the U.S. Navy that a lot of those prejudices were maybe not real smart. And fortunately, I was surrounded by people who encouraged me to question those kinds of things. When I started seminary in 2000, the topic of human sexuality and the church's relationship to LGBTQIA plus people was a very live conversation, although at that time we weren't even inclusive enough to say LGBTQIA plus. We were talking about gay and lesbian people. And that was about as far as we had stretched ourselves yet. But that was really like the live question in contemporary theology as I started school. And as I continued to study and delve deeper into the tradition and wrestle with these questions in prayer and study of Scripture and talking with real life human beings, some of whom are LGBTQIA plus and some of whom are cishet, the more I really came to understand that I cannot in good conscience believe that God condemns any of God's children for who they happen to love or for the fact that their gender identity and their sense of who they are as a person doesn't match with what we biologically assigned to them when they were born. Eventually, in 2009, my church decided as a denomination that we would allow for the ordination of LGBTQIA plus clergy who were in committed relationships. Prior to that point, you could be gay or lesbian and be a Lutheran pastor, at least in my denomination. You just had to be celibate. So we changed that, and we also agreed that clergy could bless same-sex unions because at that point same-sex marriage was not yet legal everywhere. And I have continued to grow in my understanding of these issues, but the one thing that I have continued to understand, and that my understanding of this continues to be stretched, is that so many of the people that we as church pushed aside and minoritized and marginalized for the better part of 2,000 years are just as much beloved children of God as I am. And I think there's a difference between saying, well, these are beloved children of God, but they're, living in sin or whatever. versus saying these are beloved children of God who are living out their identity as children of God just as faithfully as I am. Whether that's in a committed same-sex relationship, or whether that is as a transgender or a non-binary or a gender fluid person. So that's kind of where I have been for a while, and really kind of the watershed moment for me. There have been a couple, but about 7 or 8 years ago, I was serving in a small town in central Pennsylvania. One of the local funeral directors called me. In a small town, the funeral directors and the clergy all kind of get to know each other. And he called me and he asked if I was available for a funeral on a particular date. And I checked my calendar and I said yes. He says, well, before you agree to do this funeral, there's 2 things you should know. And I said, okay. And he said, the first thing you need to know is that the deceased was transgender. And I said, okay, no problem. So what? And he said, the other thing you need to know is that the deceased died by suicide. And again, I said, okay, no problem. So what? And he said, well, I felt like I needed to tell you those things because the reason that his home pastor is not doing the funeral is because of those 2 things. His home pastor refused to do the funeral. And I was just absolutely incensed by that. And I said, give me his family's contact information. I will reach out to them. And I officiated at a funeral for this young trans man. And I continued to be friends with his mother and to stay in contact with her. And then sort of the next big moment of like a watershed moment for me that really kind of opened my eyes was in 2021, Transgender Day of Visibility, March 31st. I had come home from work. I was still wearing my collar. I opened up TikTok. I'd only been on TikTok for about 3 months at that point. And I was seeing all of these texts about Transgender Day of Visibility. And so I told that story that I just told about this funeral for Andy as a TikTok video. And I said, if your theology tells you that you have to hound one of God's beautiful and beloved children out of your church to the point that they take their own life, then your theology is an abomination.
No.
If your theology will not allow you to minister to a family in their hour of grief, then your theology is an abomination. And if your theology tells you that one of God's beautiful and beloved children who dies as a result of the despair that is brought on by that kind of bullying and hate, if your theology tells you that that person is an abomination, then your theology is an abomination. And I closed by saying, to my transgender siblings, I want you to know that you are valid and you are precious and you are loved. And I hit post and I posted the video and I closed the app and I didn't really think much about it the rest of the evening. And the next day I opened up the app and that video had gone viral. It had just absolutely blown up. And people started telling me their stories. People started telling me their stories of having been shunned, of having been shut out, of having been condemned. Good, faithful, loving people who were just trying to understand who God had made and called them to be, being driven out of the church by this kind of homophobic and transphobic bigotry. And I just felt like I had to respond to that. And so that's kind of where, my content went. When I first got on TikTok, my wife and my teenage kids had to kind of badger me for a couple of months to get me to even download TikTok. My initial thought was that I was simply going to be a consumer. I was not going to make any content. And if I ever did make any content, it would be woodworking content because I'm a woodworker in my spare time. And that's how I wound up with this username of Knothead9620. Because 96 was the year I graduated from college and 20 was the year that I downloaded TikTok. So that's, that's about as much depth and meaning as there is to my username. But I just wound up responding to these stories from people, and responding to the homophobes and the transphobes who would come out to say horrible things to people. And, fast forward a couple of years and here we are. 2.5 years later, I'm still making content about the fact that the God that I know loves and welcomes all of God's people.
Amen. Yeah, there's a considerable amount of confusion in my mind how people can read stories like Jesus ministering to the woman at the well, a woman who was a social pariah and married multiple times and living with a man who wasn't her husband, who was at the well because the other women wouldn't allow her to come at the times that they were going. That's why she's there alone. And she is accepted, and can hear those kind of stories and say, oh, well, it's my job to go and bash a teenager who is already thinking about suicide for who they believe or know themselves to be. And then to even, some of the virulent things you see online where people even say, it's such a mental disorder, it'd be better if they were dead rather than living in this way. And I just think, how do you reconcile that with anything you see written in Christ's teachings? It's very confusing to me.
And it's mind-numbing to me. I can't figure it out either. I don't understand how you can read stories of a man who routinely associated with the outcast and the despised and the ignored.
The literal lepers.
And then, lepers, Samaritans, Syrophoenician women, Canaanite women, a Gerasene who, in addition to being a Gentile, is possessed by, a legion of demons. All these people who Jesus routinely reaches out to with love and grace and compassion. And I don't know how you go from that to the faithful thing God wants me to do here is bash this child. I don't that doesn't compute for me. And as you said, some of the really virulently hateful stuff that gets said, I want to say to these folks, do you hear yourself?
Yeah.
Do you really hear what you're saying out loud here? And do you honestly believe that is Christ-like? And that is what Christ would have you do? Okay, fine. If somebody is adamant that being LGBTQIA plus is a sin, okay, I disagree. And I've spent an awful lot of time studying the theology and the scriptures and digging into the original languages in the Hebrew and the Greek and all of that stuff. And I disagree with that position. But if I grant you that you believe that, even so, I don't know how you can believe that it is a faithful thing to turn around and tell those people that they are better off dead. I don't know how you see that and say that is Christ-like.
I mean, you look at what are the major teachings of Christ. Love one another. Do not judge. Do not commit violence against each other even when you have been wronged. Turn the other cheek. Nowhere in it does it say harass one another. Nowhere does it say go grab a gun and threaten somebody or shoot them. And I'm going to ask a little bit of a loaded question here, but in your mind, these people who are claiming to be followers of Christ, claim to be Christian, but are acting in such a virulent, hate-filled, raging, angry, violent way, do you think they are Christians, or do you feel like this is something else?
That it's a challenging question. Because it really comes down to what defines a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And if we define being a Christian as following the teachings and the example of Christ, then I think the answer is absolutely no. um, because Christ modeled extreme nonviolence. You know, um, he's on trial before Pontius Pilate, and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my followers would be fighting even now to free me from you." Jesus modeled that kind of nonviolence in the face of unjust power, even to the point of his own cross. So I don't really see how you can claim to be a follower of Jesus and advocate, um, you know, violent repression of other human beings. The flip side of that coin, though, and the reason I hesitate to say no, they are not Christian, is because there's a tendency among some Christians, and I get where it comes from, that it's a sort of natural defensiveness to say, well, those aren't real Christians. And what happens when we do that is, one, we ignore and we let ourselves off the hook for the religious trauma that is done to their victims, right? Because we can say, well, those weren't really Christians who did that to you. The other thing is, we let ourselves off the hook for not holding those people accountable. And to the average person on the street, if somebody claims to be a Christian, if somebody worships in a building that says such and such church on the outside of it, if they have a steeple that's got a cross on it, the average person on the street looks at that and says, that's a Christian church. Those people are Christians. And they're not going to parse out all of the fine distinctions, right? And so, when I talk to Lutherans, like I talk to the people in my congregation and I tell them about some of the hate speech that I hear from Christians, particularly online, and they're absolutely appalled that, that's what people see and what people hear as Christian. And what I tend to say to Lutherans, because Lutherans, we tend to be kind of shy and retiring people. You're not going to find Lutherans standing on a street corner with bullhorn like street preaching. That's just not what we do. But the problem is, because we don't do that, we have ceded that space to the hate preachers. And so in the popular mind, that's what Christianity is. And so there's people in my neighborhood around my church right here who, they know this is a church. They know there's a steeple on the top. They don't understand the difference between a Lutheran and a Pentecostal and a charismatic or any of these other things, right? They don't understand the insider distinctions. And so they have no idea. They don't know that when I step up into that pulpit on Sunday morning, I'm not proclaiming that kind of homophobic hate. They don't know that when I step into that pulpit on Sunday morning, the message that I preach is one that these are beloved children of God. All they know is, this is what I see from Christians in the world. And, oh, there's a cross on that building. So those people must be these people. Mm-hmm. And I think when we say, oh, those aren't real Christians, all we're really doing is letting ourselves off the hook. And we're really minimizing and negating the traumatic experience of people who have been beaten up by the church, and who have been beaten up by people who certainly claim to be Christians. I may disagree with whether or not they are authentic followers of Jesus, but when they were beating the crap out of somebody with the Bible, they were claiming to do it as Christians.
We take it even to space churches that are supposedly inclusive, but very much preach a message of love the sinner, hate the sin, which I think for LGBTQ folks is really difficult to hear. And, I think there's a lot of us who maybe grew up in spaces like that. I grew up Methodist, so obviously that church is going through its own reckoning around LGBTQ issues right now. But that message of love the sinner, hate the sin doesn't ever feel inclusive to me, because it's this idea of, okay, well, this person that I love, this person that I'm now married to, somehow because we love each other and touch each other and are enjoying an intimate relationship together that is nourishing and beautiful and fills me with so much love of life, somehow that's sinful. That the way I'm made somehow wrong. Like, and spaces will say, "Hey, we're inclusive. You're welcome to come worship here. You do this thing that's we're going to tell you is really bad."
Mhm.
How inclusive is that really?
I would argue pretty strongly that it's not at all. Um, and the distinction that gets missed, is there same-sex sexual behavior that is sinful? Yes, just like there's heterosexual sexual behavior that is sinful. You know, um, I'm married. If I go out this evening and try to pick up a woman in a bar that I am not married to, and just start having willy-nilly extramarital affairs and what have you, and I'm hiding that from my wife, and I'm not caring about how my behavior impacts either the people that I'm having these relationships with or this person that I've made this promise of fidelity to, I would argue that is sinful behavior, right? And I think there is sexual behavior that is sinful, but what makes it sinful is not whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. What makes it sinful is it selfish? Is it dishonest? Is it harmful? Um, is it non-consensual? Those kinds of questions are the ones we should be asking. And I think, we had a fair number of folks leave this parish in the last year because I said we needed to have a conversation about being formally and explicitly open and affirming. We just needed to have the conversation and know how we felt about it. And some people got very mad that I suggested there was even anything to talk about, and got mad and left in a huff. And some of the things that were said were like, well, of course they're welcome here. They've always been welcome here. I'm like, okay, but how welcome are they really if you expect me to step into the pulpit every Sunday and proclaim that their marriage is an abomination, when their marriage is as long-standing and as faithful and as loving as any of the heterosexual marriages that I see? And I wrestled with this position for a long time because to me, 2,000 years of church tradition is not something you set aside lightly. And so, as I was in seminary and I was doing this study and I was digging into these scriptural texts and things, I really, really wrestled with it. And another one of those watershed moments for me happened in 2007. I was a voting member to our annual church-wide, we call it a church-wide assembly, which is, it's like a big convention of Lutherans from all over the country. Happens every 2 or 3 years. And I was a voting member in 2007 when we thought we were going to make decisions about inclusion. And, there were the people who were very adamantly opposed, and there were the people who were very adamantly in favor. And I was really wrestling. I was leaning in the direction of the in favor of full inclusion. That's what my head told me, and my gut told me, this is a big step to take. And so I was still wrestling with it. And one evening after we were done with the meetings for the day, I was sitting in the hotel lobby waiting for some friends of mine to come downstairs so we could go out to dinner. And I became aware of these 4 people at the table behind me talking. And I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't really miss what they were saying. And it became clear pretty quickly that they were what I would now call homophobic. And they were talking about the kind of underhanded, frankly dishonest, and nasty tactics that they were prepared to use the next day during the debate to get their way. And I was just appalled sitting and hearing this. And, I looked over my shoulder, and all 4 of them are wearing collars. This was 4 pastors talking about this. And I was just about to stand up and say something to them, and my friends showed up, and they, walked me out to dinner because they could tell I was hot. They're like, "Okay, let's get you out of here before you, unload on these people." Maybe they should have let me. But we went out to dinner, and I came back, and I was still thinking about this, and it was still kind of grinding my gears. And I was just walking around the hotel, just kind of walking and talking to God and praying. And I walked down this long hallway, and there were all of these conference rooms and banquet rooms and stuff down this hallway. And I walked past one of them, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw this young person who I recognized. I had gone to seminary with their mom. And I was like, "Oh, I know them." And so I stopped and I went back, and what I discovered was that banquet room was the headquarters for Reconciling Works, which is the Lutheran organization in favor of full inclusion. And this young person that I knew was there with Reconciling Works, and there were like 35 or 40 people in this room, probably between the ages of 16 and 80. And they were all sitting around on the floor in a circle, legs crossed, hands out, holding hands with the person next to them. And as I stood there in the doorway of that room, I listened to them praying for people like those 4 people upstairs. They were sitting there praying for the very people who thought they had no place in God's family. And they weren't praying, God change their hearts. They weren't praying, God strike them down with lightning. They were praying, God bless those who disagree with us.
Yeah.
And I very rarely can say I've heard God speak, but this was one time when I'm almost sure I heard God speak, and I heard Christ say the words, "By their fruits you will know them." Yeah. And from that moment forward, I have not had a single doubt about the full inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people in the kingdom of God. Not one.
That's beautiful.
And when I look at the people who want to say things like, love the sinner, hate the sin, I notice we only say that about the sins of people who sin differently from us, right? We only say that about the sins that we choose to condemn. Jesus talked more about money and possessions than he ever talked about sexuality. But I don't hear people clamoring for pastors to preach strong messages against consumerism and capitalism. It's really, this is the one area where we will talk about love the sinner, hate the sin, when really what we mean is kind of sort of be inclusive, but yeah, it's icky and it freaks us out, so we're still going to condemn it. Instead of, what I always tell people when they say, love the sinner, hate the sin, 2 things. One, Jesus never gave us permission to hate anyone or anything, because Jesus knows we can't be trusted with that. Because hate the sin over the last 2,000 years of church history has all too often turned into going from hate the sin to hate the sinner to burn the sinner at the stake. Mm-hmm. And we've been down that road again and again and again. And that's why I believe Jesus never told us to hate anyone or anything, because Jesus knows we can't be trusted with that kind of license.
And frankly,
the other thing I tell people is, if you want to love the sinner and hate the sin, by all means, hate your own sin. And if you're anything like me, that will keep you plenty busy without having any time or energy left to hate anybody else's sin.
Well, and frankly, too, it's very clear, God is love, right? So if you want to dwell in the experience of what is God, be love. End of story.
Right.
It's not like God is love, but he sometimes hates you. Maybe Old Testament God, but New Testament God is just love.
And I don't think even Old Testament God hates us. I think Old Testament God has a powerful and all-consuming love for the vulnerable, and that when that ignites God's wrath, that then gets filtered through an Iron Age society that was, pretty violent. And so, they filter their experience of God through the rest of their experience of the world. But, one of the things that I've noticed reading, particularly the prophets in the Old Testament, is that when the thing that really gets the prophets of the Old Testament fired up and angry and proclaiming the wrath of God, is two things. One is running after false gods. The other thing is failure to care for the poor, the outcast, the vulnerable, and the excluded. It's page after page after page of you have failed to care for the widow, the orphan, the alien in your midst. If anybody should be afraid of the wrath of the Old Testament God, I don't think it's gay people. I think it's the people who are, putting up walls on borders against refugees.
And we heard the Pope just very recently, his words coming out saying something very similar about saying, you're so obsessed with abortion, why are you not equally obsessed with immigrants and caring for the poor? Why is that such a hot button topic for you? Why is it so political? And there's so many people who have been commenting nowadays, if Christ as we see him, as he was, were to show up today, he would be crucified again by many in that
Oh,
created themselves Christian.
very quickly. Because really, and this, I think, this gets at another one of my hot button topics, which is Christian anti-Semitism. There are people who want to believe that, the Jews are guilty because they killed Jesus. No, religious bigotry killed Jesus. Religious bigotry allied with state power. And religious bigotry allied with state power is just as problematic today as it was then. And it doesn't care about creed, and religious bigotry and fundamentalism, whether it's Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, allied with unjust state power, always leads to vulnerable people being slaughtered. I mean, you can look at something like the Rohingya Muslims in Burma being persecuted and excluded and, the victims of genocide at the hands of state power in a majority Buddhist country. And we tend to think, when we think genocide, we don't usually, the next word out of in our brain isn't usually Buddhism, right? And rightly so. But, regardless of your religious creed, if your religious creed says anyone who disagrees with you is less than and is therefore an enemy of yours and an enemy of God's, and you ally that with unchecked state power, that is a recipe for genocide every time.
Yeah.
And Christians have more than enough blood on our hands before we would ever dream of pointing fingers at anybody else for that kind of thing.
Yeah. The very first video I saw of yours, which I very much enjoyed, was you were showing a clip of some young influencer claiming that he's being persecuted currently in America for being Christian. And you slapped the camera with a piece of paper like, stop it. You are not being persecuted. There are Christians in the world being persecuted. You are not one of them.
Right. And American Christianity has this persecution complex. I've wrestled with that a lot. And in fact, just this past Sunday, for those of us in churches that use the Revised Common Lectionary, the assigned gospel reading for this past Sunday was Jesus making his first passion prediction in Matthew, and Peter telling him, Lord, you got to stop saying these things. This must never happen to you. And Jesus saying, get behind me, Satan, right? And then he goes on to say, if you would be my follower, you must take up your cross and follow me. And when Jesus said that, he was not talking about you must throw a fit when the cashier at the gas station says happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas. That's not persecution. when Jesus said, take up your cross, he said that to people who had a very literal and visceral understanding of what crucifixion was. Everybody who heard him say those words had seen somebody crucified, and they knew the absolute ghastly and brutal realities of that. And so for him to say, take up your cross and follow me, was not pitch a fit because the soccer league decides to hold games on Sunday morning. You know, we want to think that we're so persecuted, and the realization that I've come to just in the last couple of weeks, reflecting on that, is I think we do that because then we feel like we're doing what Jesus told us to. If we think that happy holidays is persecution, if we think that Starbucks putting snowmen and snowflakes on their Christmas cup instead of crosses and mangers is persecution, then we can convince ourselves that we have taken up our cross and followed Jesus when we've done nothing of the sort.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just in Rome this summer and visiting the catacombs of the early martyrs of the church, and how so many quite literally willingly died for their beliefs, which is a very different situation than the Starbucks coffee cup.
Oh yeah, and another thing that, and this was a piece of history that I wasn't aware of until just a couple of years ago, that one of the things that sort of spurred the spread of Christianity in the first couple of centuries, when it was still basically an outlaw religion, was that when the plague came to town and everybody fled, the Christians would stick around and care for the sick. And they cared for the sick regardless of whether the sick were Christians or Jews or pagans or whatever. They just stuck around and loved their neighbor. And maybe if we stopped running around screaming at people, and picketing outside of Planned Parenthood clinics, and condemning people who sin different than we do, and we just went out of our way to love hurting people in need, we certainly would be better off, and the world would be too.
I'm a big believer that people treat other people how they feel about themselves, and that somebody who has achieved a state of deep contentment and love and joy and acceptance within will generally project that outwards. Because why would you be hateful? Why would you be rageful? Your outer world and your inner world reflect one another. And so I see these people with a high level of pain, high level of anger, dissatisfaction within, usually self-directed, which reminds me of what you were saying earlier about praying for those people, praying for your enemies, praying for those who hurt you, and what a blessing that is to achieve that state of compassion where you love and bless everyone regardless. The question I have is, do we have any responsibility for what brought them to that state? And I ask this because one of the things you said several minutes ago now, which I so appreciated, was you were comparing, you going out and having multiple affairs and betraying your wife as being a type of sinful sex. Do we owe any responsibility for the fact that for a very long time now, at least centuries, if not millennia, we've been preaching this idea to people of original sin, to tell them, to emphasize this message that you were born a sinner, you were born broken, you were born disconnected from God, and now you have to work to repair that, versus emphasizing this idea of you were born in God's image, you are, the Holy Ghost lives within you, you are God's children, and emphasizing the beautiful, holy, sacred aspect of who we are as human. But we for so long have been told you are a schmuck, and now people act like we're surprised.
Right. And I think we do bear a lot of responsibility there. And I think we need to really be mindful of just how much trauma is out there in the world, and how many people are carrying around these enormous loads of shame and pain, and I think, so one of the groups here in my parish is doing a book study right now on a book called Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion by Father Greg Boyle, who is a Jesuit priest, and started something called Homeboy Industries. And the book is about the importance of compassion in responding to that kind of shame and trauma and things. And, reading that through the lens of his experience working with young people trapped in poverty and in gang warfare in Los Angeles. Powerful book. It's a book that I recommend every Christian read. But, as we have been talking about that and reading that book together and realizing, for a 15 or 16-year-old kid in the projects in Los Angeles, the defense against that kind of internalized shame, what sort of makes it bearable or keeps it just out on the edge, just enough for them to, get out of bed in the morning, is that swagger that comes with being part of a gang, and that tough and braggadocious exterior and, fuck the world and whatever. And I think there are so many people, it's not as obvious. It's not always as obvious as it is with a 15-year-old or 16-year-old kid who's in a gang. But man, there's an awful lot of, I think, evangelical Christians who are dragging around just as much shame and misery and pain. And the way they keep that at arm's reach so that they can get through the day is by visiting that rage on the people around them.
Yeah.
And I think we, the church, bear a lot of responsibility for that. And I'm glad you brought up original sin, because again, that's one of those doctrines that, we didn't question for such a long time. And more, I keep coming back to the universality of sin, but original blessedness. That the original state of humanity, God on the sixth day of creation looks around at all that God has made, which includes humanity, and behold, it was very good. For the first 5 days, God beheld what God had done, and it was good. And on day 6, it is very good. And it's on day 6 that it includes humanity. And, helping people reclaim their very goodness, their blessedness, their createdness in the image of God. And yeah, we all sin. I've never yet met anybody who didn't, right? But that's what we do, not who we are. And yes, we need to take sin seriously. And yes, my tradition, we start worship every Sunday with confession and forgiveness. And I always say we do that because we need it. I certainly need it. I don't know if anybody else in the congregation needs it, but every Sunday I need to say again, I am a sinner. And I need to hear again that promise that God loves and redeems and forgives me, not because I deserve it, but because God is loving and redeeming and forgiving. And now that that's taken care of, now we can roll into praising God. Now we can roll into hearing where God is calling us out into the world. And Martin Luther had this formulation that we are at once both sinful and justified. Simul justus et peccator. In fact, that is so central to my theology, it's tattooed on my arm. Yes, I am a sinner, but I am also justified and put into a right relationship with God by God's grace, made real to me in Jesus Christ. And my deepest identity is not broken worm scumbucket sinner. My deepest identity is beloved child of God.
Yeah.
And nothing I do or fail to do, and nothing that happens to me or doesn't happen to me is ever going to change that. And I think we as church need to start teaching original blessedness. And we need to start teaching people, yes, your sins may be serious, and you may have to make amends for them. You may need to even pay a price for those sins, right? But they don't change the reality that deep down at your innermost core, your identity is not sinner. It is beloved child of God.
Love that. It's very similar and in very different words to how I often talk about the idea of being perfectly imperfect, that you are inherently whole, you are inherently radiant. And the fact that you are not perfect is part of that experience. That doesn't take
Hmm.
away from it. That is part of what makes you divine. Um, I love this thing that you brought up, and I just want to go back to it for one quick second, is that how that rage, how that anger can deflect you from what's going on. And I think we have all experienced the feeling of being righteous, that feeling of, I get to be angry, I get to be upset because I'm right. And how, for a moment, how empowering that feels. And the issue is that anger is never healing. It never ultimately makes you feel better. For a moment, like you're in the heat of an argument, it makes you feel really good. But as soon
Hmm.
as that anger's gone, you're just left with shame around it. You're left with emptiness. You're left with fear, often sorrow, and
Guilt.
guilt. And that's part of, I personally believe that nothing done in anger is ever done well. That it just
Hmm.
ends up causing more problems than it ends up absolving. Um, but to let go of that addiction to anger, to let go of that rage, and to say, there's other feelings that are hiding below that rush, that high that comes from that righteous retribution. And to allow yourself to sit with that sorrow, to sit with that dissatisfaction, to sit with that disappointment, to sit with those feelings and start to work through them so you can get to the place of love, so you can get to the healing, so you can get to the connection with your brothers and sisters and siblings and to find that love. But so long as you stay in anger, you're in a way medicating yourself against feeling the things that you need to be feeling.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you used the word addiction because, what I was thinking when you were describing how good self-righteous anger feels is, rage is a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
Um, and it does. It feels great. It feels powerful. It feels righteous and good. And man, is it toxic. Um, and it does become addictive. I think that's why there are some people who are just perpetually enraged. And I think as a society in the last 15 years, we have developed that addiction. Um, and there are people who turn on their television or, open up social media every single day looking for their fix,
Yeah.
looking for something to be enraged about. And this is not a phenomenon that is limited to one end of the political spectrum or the other.
Or one religion,
This
or
is
one group. Everybody has it.
right. Um, and I know I've certainly been prone to it at times in my life. And I'm like you, I have found that nothing I do in anger ever goes well. Um, and I wind up having to make amends. I wind up damaging people and relationships. Um, and but boy, is it hard to remember that when somebody says something, and in that split second, man, the adrenaline dumps and my mouth opens and stuff will come out of my mouth that I'm like, I'm ashamed of it before it even comes out, but I can't stop it. And fortunately, one of the things that I've learned is the importance of taking care of my own spiritual condition, because that's the antidote.
Yeah.
When I am caring for my own spiritual condition, when I'm caring for my own physical condition, when I'm, getting enough rest and exercising and eating right and not working myself into the ground and not skimping on my prayer time because I'm too busy and whatever, um, you know, that's when I'm less likely to do that. I'm not immune. I'm never immune. Um, but I'm more mindful. Um, and you know, there's enough rage in the world, and there's enough things in the world to generate rage. I don't need to be adding to it. Um, and I think to exercise compassion for our neighbors, and to exercise compassion for ourselves. And this was an insight that this took me much longer to figure out than it should have. Um, I'm a little embarrassed by how long I was a pastor before I figured this out. But I've always believed that you got to set boundaries against bad behavior. Um, and eventually, I discovered that a lot of what we call bad behavior in the church is really unresolved anxiety and grief and pain,
Yeah.
and shame. And the woman who taught me this, God bless her, she's since gone home to Jesus, but I'm not going to mention her name. But she would go in cycles. And, everybody knew that she said what she thought what she said, and whatever. And sometimes she would say things in ways that were hurtful to other people. And a lot of people would just sort of give her grace for that. But sometimes, I really had to intervene. I had to, call her and say, hey, you need to call so and so and apologize. And finally, after a couple of these cycles and way too long of being a pastor before this dawned on me, suddenly I realized that what was really going on was she was anxious about something. And so what I started doing was, when I would have these incidents come up and somebody would tell me so and so is really hurt because of something that this woman had said, I'd call her up and I'd say, can I come out and talk to you? And she'd say, sure. And I'd go out to her house and I'd say, I need you to call Gladys or whoever, and apologize because what you said was hurtful. And we'd kind of go back and forth a little bit, and she would justify what she said and why she said it. And I would say, yes, I know, I understand where you're coming from, but it was hurtful and you still need to call and apologize. And eventually she would agree, yes, okay, I'll call and apologize. And then it clicked in my head one day, and this was a God moment. This was not me, suddenly realizing something. This was God, kicking me in the pants and saying, ask the next question. And the next question was, now, what are you anxious about?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on that you're so upset about? Because I know you don't care this much about, what font we use in the newsletter or whatever it was that had spun her up and caused her to upset this other person. I said, I know you don't care that much about this. So what is it? What's really eating at you? And she just kind of looked at me, and her lips started to quiver and her eyes welled up, and she then shared with me that she had just learned that her son-in-law, who she absolutely adored, had just gotten a diagnosis of stage 3 cancer. And she felt so completely powerless and so completely out of control of this big, huge, massive thing going on in her life,
Yeah.
that church was the one place where she felt like she could exercise some control. So she did. And she did it in a way that was harmful to someone else. And I think so much of the harmful behavior that we see from people is about unresolved anxiety and pain and grief and shame. And sometimes it's self-destructive. It's, drug and alcohol addiction. It's sex addiction. It's gambling. It's, all of those destructive behaviors that we can inflict on ourselves because we're trying to self-medicate.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's inflicted on other people. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan priest and really gifted spiritual writer, and wrote, we will either transform our pain or we will transmit it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people, many, many, many people, just have no idea how to transform it. So they're left with no choice but to transmit it.
Yeah.
And so one of the most important lessons I have ever learned as a parish pastor is, when somebody does something harmful or somebody does something hurtful to another person, absolutely set a boundary against that behavior, because there's certain things that, are just not okay. You're not allowed to say horrible, hateful things to people in the church. I'm sorry, you just can't. And when you do, I'm going to ask you to apologize and mean it. And in addition to setting that boundary, now let's talk about what's really going on. Let's address the pastoral concern that's underneath it. Let's address the pain and the fear and the anxiety and the shame that is driving that. Because, otherwise we just wind up setting the same boundary again and again and again and again against that same behavior. But if we start addressing the pain that's under it, the behavior will change of its own.
Yeah, I mean, there's.
And
But
I was just going to say, and that's why, yeah, I will, slap the camera with the rolled up worship bulletin because I think we need that sometimes. Um, but also, I feel so badly for so many of these very conservative Christians who are running around inflicting pain on other human beings because it's got to be awful to drag that kind of toxicity around with you everywhere you go. Um, and to have been brainwashed into believing that that is an acceptable way of expressing your own pain.
and we look at the people who, and this is any tradition, I don't care if it's Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or whatever, who have attained what we would call like a level of sainthood, where they have learned to dwell in peace. They have learned to reckon within themselves whatever they needed to reckon with, heal whatever they need to heal, work through whatever they need to work through so that they can dwell in a state of peace. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those are our journeys we have to go on. By being angry at you, I'm not going to help you come to terms with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
We have to turn our focus inward, right? Like it's, look at the what's in your own eye rather than what is in the person across from you. We have to do our own work and help each other, yes, but to take responsibility for our own state.
Mm-hmm. And I think to respond to that person who is being so incredibly harmful with, firm boundaries and compassion at the same time. I used to have, in a previous office in a previous parish, I had a little piece of paper that I had written on a sticky note. And it was just a reminder for me. I kept it on the wall right above my computer screen. Jesus loved and died for the Pharisees too, but he didn't let them set the agenda. And I think it's easy for us to forget because, Jesus had some pretty harsh words for people, for some of his opponents. And often it was for people who were inflicting religious trauma on others, right? You read Matthew 23, it's a whole chapter of Jesus just teeing off on the supposedly religiously upright for the ways that they are harming others with their religion. And it's just, I think, important for us to remember that even as Jesus was taking them to task and calling them whitewashed tombs and all of those other things, he was also still loving them. That, I come back to Jesus praying, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing, about the people who were literally in the act of driving nails through his flesh.
Yes.
That's the kind of compassion that Jesus invites us into. And to have that kind of compassion for the broken and the outcast right outside our door, to have that kind of compassion for the poor and the immigrant and the forgotten, to have that kind of compassion for ourselves and for our own failings and our own sins and our own times that we have not been what we think we should have been, and to have that kind of compassion for the neighbor who has harmed us. That, to be able to say, I'm not endorsing this behavior. This behavior was harmful, but I'm not going to let this behavior dictate the course of my life. To me, that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about me making a decision about how I'm going to relate to this trauma. And also to recognize that the person who inflicted that trauma was probably coming out of their own trauma too.
Last question for you.
Sure.
There's a lot of people who watch my channel who grew up in a sect of Christianity where they felt like a pariah, where they felt outcast by it, and subsequently probably left the church or at least substantially questioned their connection with it. What would you say to them or to any member of the LGBTQ community who is made to feel like they don't belong because of who they are? What would you say to them directly?
19 years ago, I was interviewing for my very first call, and I was asked, what are your career goals as a pastor? And like, the only career goal I have is to be a good and faithful parish pastor in the place God is calling me to be. And that was a true statement then. It's a true statement now. I do have one other career goal. If my presiding bishop called me up tomorrow morning and said, "Hey, we just got $500,000 worth of funding, and we want to finance you to go out and do the ministry that you most feel called to do. What do you want to do?" I would say I want to start Christ the Outcast Lutheran Church and Tattoo Parlor. And I joke about that, but it's only half a joke, because I think there really ought to be a lot more churches called Christ the Outcast.
Yeah.
Because he was.
Yeah.
Christ sat with the sinners because he was an outcast just like they were. And so for people who have been driven out, for people who have been pushed aside, for people who have been made to feel like there is no place for them in the church, what I would say to them very directly is, you are a beloved child of God, and there is always, always a place for you at Christ's table, because he said so. We follow, as Christians, we follow a crucified Messiah. And the Romans were fairly brutal people, as a lot of people in their era were, but they were not indiscriminate. The Romans were very picky about who they crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for notorious bandits, outcasts, and fugitive slaves. If you were a citizen of the empire, it was illegal to crucify you. It happened sometimes, but it was technically illegal. It's not by accident that that's how Jesus died, because Jesus died as an outcast for the sake of the outcast, to make the point that no matter how outcast you are not beyond the reach of the love and the grace of God. And anybody who tells you otherwise doesn't understand Jesus. Because none of us have the authority to tell you that God doesn't love you, because God has declared, I have called you by name and you are mine.
Some might go even as far to say that there's something sacred about the experience of being outcast.
Absolutely.
It's a theory I've had for a long time, that being an outsider gives you a different perspective on the world, a view that some might say is very akin to a heavenly view, because you're seeing the other side, you're seeing things for the way they could be rather than the way that they are.
And it is the outcasts who teach us compassion. And again, if you think about the great saints of the church, right, or the great spiritual giants, so often they were people who, either by choice or by circumstance, or even by their own self-perception, were outcast in one way or another. I keep coming back to the thing that got Jesus in so much trouble was not because he was hanging out with the righteous and the upright. What got him in trouble was he was hanging out with the outcasts and the lowlifes. And if Jesus spent all of his time on the margins, among the outcasts, among the rejected, among the forgotten, among the miserable, and the ne'er-do-wells, and all of those folks, then maybe we as the church, as the body of Christ, ought to spend our time there too.
Amen. Pastor Bob, thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening conversation and such a joy to get to connect with you. Please follow him on TikTok. If you'd like to see his full sermons, you can see them on YouTube under his church's page. I will drop those links in the description below. Thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to add or share before we sign off?
Just to say thank you for the time, and again, to say to folks, remember, you are deeply and profoundly loved.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.